and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to listeners to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. Crises, whatever their nature, have a way of putting up a mirror to the face of societies. They throw our angels and our demons into sharp relief, and pandemics are no different. All across the world, going back to medieval times, outbreaks of new and mysterious diseases have spurred the creation of narratives that seek to cast blame on a foreign source of the epidemic, persecuting and stigmatizing minorities and other vulnerable groups. Historians have documented how syphilis took on a variety of names as it spread through the Eurasian landmass in the 15th and 16th centuries, for example. Outside Naples and Italy, it was known as the Neapolitan disease. In France, it was called the Italian disease. Germans called it the Polish disease, and for Poles, it was, you guessed it, the German disease. Fast forward to the present day, and we need look no further than the White House for an example of how Chinese people are being blamed in response to the coronavirus pandemic. On first glance, this can seem utterly dispiriting. Despite all of our advances in hygiene and sanitation, breakthroughs in medical science that have led us to live longer and more comfortable lives than at any time in history, we still can't resist the urge to scapegoat. Given our current unfortunate reality, political leadership and international solidarity are more important than ever. Unfortunately, as Stewart Patrick writes in his WPR column this week, global leadership is in short supply, just when we need it the most. What might an alternative universe look like? And how can we learn from history and find ways to escape these old painful habits? Joining me now to discuss is Graham Mooney. He's an associate professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, and his most recent book is Intrusive Interventions: Public Health, Domestic Space, and Infectious Disease Surveillance in England, 1840 to 1914. Graham, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you for having me.
So by now we're all familiar with these xenophobic tropes being parroted by our leaders. There's the quote-unquote Chinese virus, which President Trump has gone out of his way to use at every chance he gets, but also the conspiracy theories and disinformation spread by Chinese officials that the virus might have originated on a U.S. military base. For you, as a historian specializing in pandemics, I imagine none of this sounds new, does it?
No, absolutely not. It's a very common, as you say, it's a common trope to seek to blame the other in quote unquote marks. People who are not yourself, people who come from somewhere else, of a different ethnicity or religion or race, that supposedly pose a threat. So this kind of victim blaming and xenophobia and stigmatization isn't new at all.
What are some of the examples that leap to mind for you and that might be most salient that we can learn from in our current situation?
Well, there's a long list, as you can imagine, going back to the Black Death in the 14th century in Europe, where there was persecution of the Jews. Jumping forward into the 19th century, there were similar kinds of reactions towards the Jewish population in big cities like New York. Immigrants coming from Europe who were seen as being carriers of the disease. There are examples in the early 20th century, particularly in San Francisco. That's a very well-known example during a plague outbreak when the Chinese community there were vilified as well. So there are lots of examples like that. And there are also kind of some interesting examples of it almost working in a slightly different way, in the sense that poor, vulnerable people responding to epidemic diseases with civil unrest and protest against local elites and local politicians. So there are kind of different ways in which blame and stigma can work.
What are some of those examples of local populations rising up, and what have been the consequences in those situations?
Well, they're most commonly associated with cholera outbreaks during the 19th century. Cholera, from the early 19th century into the early 20th century, there were 7 cholera pandemics, and they had an enormous toll on mortality and morbidity. It was a very, very frightening disease because it it killed very quickly. Once you contracted the disease, you could be gone within 24 hours. So it was very much a disease of fear. So it wasn't unsurprising that sort of rumour and gossip were rampant during cholera outbreaks in some places. And the thing about cholera is that slightly different to coronavirus or the influenza pandemic of 1918-19 is it's transmitted via contaminated water and food. And one of the sort of responses of working class and poor people was that the water was being poisoned with cholera in order to thin out poor populations. And that sounds faintly, again, conspiracy theories are not an uncommon, not an uncommon trope during moments of crisis and fear. But these kinds of rumours tended to proliferate on fertile ground, in the sense that, for example, in Scotland in the 1830s, there was a very immediate and recent popular memory of physicians body snatching or grave robbing in order to perform anatomical investigations on bodies. So poor people were really scared and worried that they were being taken to hospitals in order to be experimented upon. So those sorts of fears are easily exploited during epidemics. So that's one example of a way in which the general public can respond with uprisings and with resistance to perceived injustices in non-epidemic and non-pandemic times.
It does seem like a lot of these narratives seize upon sources of anxiety and fear that are prevalent at whatever time. You mentioned the scapegoating of Jews during previous outbreaks, for instance, or perhaps the rampant homophobia during the HIV/AIDS epidemic that we're still seeing in some ways. And with the current outbreak, we see it happening at the same time as a sort of pervasive fear of the rise of China and a deterioration in broader U.S.-China relations. How much of that do you think is playing into some of the current rhetoric and examples of verbal and physical abuse we're seeing of Chinese people and people of Chinese descent?
Similar to the previous answer, really. These things tend to, they exploit things that are already present in society. So one of the reasons why historians study epidemics, obviously there's a question of the high mortality and high morbidity that they can cause, which is, incredibly stressful for a society. But what they also do is they tend to expose pre-existing issues and problems. So if we go back to the example I mentioned earlier of bubonic plague in San Francisco in the early 20th century, that was what happened there. There was an outbreak in 1904. There was a suspicion that the cases originated were in Chinatown in San Francisco. And so the public health authorities put a physical quarantine around Chinatown. They literally roped it off, and they prevented people from going in and out. But they prevented Chinese people from going in and out. They didn't prevent white people from going in and out. And the actual quarantine itself didn't last that long. It was lifted after a couple of days because of protests and also because the uncertainty over whether the original cases were bubonic plague. But what that did was it built upon already existing xenophobia towards Chinese migrants and Chinese labourers, based upon anti-Chinese immigration legislation that was developed in the 1890s, legislation that forced Chinese labourers to register their presence. So it was a very already a hostile climate towards the Chinese population in San Francisco, and it was relatively a short step for the public health authorities and the government to institute something like a quarantine that focused specifically on that part of town.
And so now we see something similar with these claims from President Trump and from others of the quote unquote Chinese virus and vilifying Chinese people. It's almost like a mirror image, really, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is, and one of the puzzling things about this is you have to ask the question: what value do people get from calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus? What is it doing for them in order to persist in calling it that? Because we're beyond it really mattering now. It doesn't matter where it originated. Certainly not in the present moment. It may matter in terms of how we understand the virus, how we can think about when this is when this particular pandemic has passed on. It might matter for us to look back and work out how it passed from animal species to humans, all the things that we need to know, but from a scientific perspective. But what work does it do for somebody like Donald Trump to call it the Chinese virus? Because it really doesn't matter anymore. It's in the US community. So I'm thinking that maybe the value it does is it deflects attention away from what's going on in the United States to blaming somebody else. It's a scapegoating mechanism. And I don't know if that's why they're doing it. I've seen reports that they were advised to start calling it the Chinese virus consistently in order to deflect that. I don't know if that's the case, but historically it's a very common trope. That you blame somebody else in order to deflect attention from what's going on in your own backyard, and so it sort of fits with that, if you like.
And certainly we are seeing the same thing from Chinese officials who are claiming that it's disingenuous to claim even that the virus did originate in China and that it's somehow irresponsible to do so.
Yeah, well, xenophobia doesn't really respect national boundaries, does it? Really, if you catch my meaning. I think all countries who are locked in these much broader economic, social, and cultural struggles are going to use this pandemic to position themselves in one way or another against other countries. So it doesn't surprise me that this is going on, and it won't surprise me that if it continues.
Your research focuses particularly on responses to outbreaks of disease in Britain during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and in particular the response by governments and intrusive surveillance measures that were put into place. What echoes do you see in particular from that era to the current pandemic?
Well, these sorts of practices, we're calling them social distancing right now. They might be technically more appropriately called physical distancing. We've called them non-pharmaceutical interventions because they tend to be interventions that took place to prevent or control epidemics when there was there were no drug therapies, there were no immunizations for a lot of the infectious diseases that were around, and they were sold, if you like, through a language of freedom. They were some of the interventions were actually very intrusive. So, for example, if you were a small child, a 7-year-old child who got scarlet fever, government would have the power to sequestrate you in a hospital until your disease had taken its course. For scarlet fever, that can be like 9 weeks. So it was very, very. It was seen as that those sorts of measures were seen as being very coercive. Particularly when you think that when a child with a disease like that was in hospital for 9 weeks and they couldn't have any visitors, they couldn't see their friends and so on. It was very, very isolating. But these sorts of policies were actually sold through a political language of freedom. So you have these coercive policies, but the way in which they were adopted and the way in which they got put onto the statute books and made into law was by politicians in particular, backed up by the public health profession, was to say, look, if you want the freedom to go to work, if you want the freedom to travel around the city and going about your daily business, if you want your kids you give your kids the freedom to go to school, then what we've got to do is not have an epidemic in our midst. And so one of the ways we can not have an epidemic is by curtailing some of our own freedoms. So, you do have to go to hospital when you have an infectious disease. You do have to stay at home if you've got an infectious disease. You can't go to school. You can't go to the theatre. You can't go to the cinema. So it's a very kind of intriguing juxtaposition that was being played out under liberalism in the 19th century. Was you have to sacrifice some freedoms in order to have more broad freedoms and freedoms for everybody else. Another thing that historians have done, a group of historians at the University of Michigan, was study mortality rates in 43 cities in the United States during the 1918 influenza pandemic. And what they found is that a lot of the social distancing measures that were put in place, closing of schools, the cancelling of public events, public gatherings, isolation of people in hospitals and also at homes, in cities where they were adopted early and they were adopted quite stringently and thoroughly, mortality rates tended to be a lot lower in cities where they weren't. So, for example, Philadelphia, which was a bit more slack, it had a big parade during the early part of the pandemic, a big public parade where thousands of people gathered on the streets. Philadelphia had a mortality rate 3 times that of somewhere like St. Louis, which closed schools early, implemented a lot of public gathering bans early. So there is a historical body of evidence that suggests that in the influenza pandemic of 1918-19, these sorts of measures did actually work.
I wonder if there's a leap that we can make from that to infer that some of the rather heavy-handed measures that China implemented, quarantining dozens of millions of people, for instance, were effective in halting the spread of the outbreak from what it was initially.
It's interesting that you call them heavy-handed because I think that was generally the response in the West in January and February. And there was a sort of feeling, well, those sorts of authoritative, autocratic responses wouldn't ever be countenanced in the West, and we're seeing now whole cities going down on lockdown and so on. So the political calculus has changed the closer that the disease has come to home, which is also not an isolated historical phenomenon. I think the important thing to remember is that with a lockdown of a whole city, where really what you're saying is nobody can move in and out of a city. One thing you're doing is preventing the export of cases to other parts of the country, which is fine. But you're not generally, if the disease has already taken place within the area that's on lockdown, it's not going to have much of an effect. Particularly with this disease, which seems to be particularly infective. So it has to go hand in hand. A lockdown, a kind of quarantine, where you're essentially throwing a border around a particular place, it has to go in hand with some of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, these social distancing measures, in order for them to manage the outbreak within the quarantined area.
Getting back to what we were talking about earlier with regard to some of these narratives of blame and scapegoating and the like, we've been talking about similarities between historical examples and the present day. It seems to me that one of the differences, though, is that right now we live in a world that is more interconnected, more integrated than ever before. And in theory, that should mean heightened awareness of the way these things spread and also heightened empathy, because after all, an outbreak over there this week is an outbreak over here next week. Has our current situation shown that to be just hopelessly idealistic?
Well, first of all, I would say that yes, we are more interconnected in the sense that more people move around the globe at quicker speeds than they have done in the past, and information can move around the globe much quicker. That doesn't mean to say that we weren't connected in the past. That doesn't mean to say that those sorts of connections that we worry about now, the global movement of goods and people, weren't present in historical pandemics, even going back to the Black Death of the 14th century and the institution of maritime quarantines. It was about preventing the movement of a disease from one country to another, or from one continent to another. So that notion of connectedness, we need to be very careful with that historically. But I do think we are now presently in the past 100 years or so, with the sort of increased use of modes of travel and new modes of travel, and the speed with which information moves around the globe. We are in a different kind of moment. I would say that on the one hand, it could be that information is more available, and it may increase empathy, but it can work the other way as well, as we're seeing. Social media can be both a positive tool for knowledge, but it can also be a cesspit of vipers who are, promoting both rumor and unsubstantiated fact, but also the sorts of xenophobia and hate that we've been discussing. So it's always a balancing act, and going back to outbreaks of the plague from the 17th century onwards, through to cholera, the progress of cholera in the 19th century, the role of information and the role of expertise and knowledge has always been contested. And the way in which, say, you were saying, a disease in one place is our disease within a week. From the 19th century, in the 19th century, for example, you had newly instituted systems whereby mortality data was collected on a routine basis for everybody, and it was published in the newspapers. So you would have a weekly count of the number of deaths in a big city, in London, Baltimore, New York, Paris, and they were seen as being a one way in which the knowledge of an epidemic and prevailing disease conditions would be understood, but also as a transparency, a question of if we know a disease is on its way, we can prepare for it. So again, that role of information, it may travel a lot quicker these days, but it's always been there, and it's always been a key part of how we respond to these kinds of frightening biological events, if you like.
So based on that, what are some positive ways that leaders in both the scientific community and also some of our leading politicians can counter the spread of xenophobia and prejudice and misinformation that we're seeing now?
Well, first of all, you always try and use the best evidence that you can get and be honest and open with it. I think there are some very interesting arguments and debates at present around, for example, the use of case fatality rates. So, your listeners may know the case fatality rate is the proportion of infected people who go on to die. And the problem with that is you need to know how many people are infected. And unless you have comprehensive testing, you don't know the answer to that. So in places where you have less testing, you're going to have a case fatality rate that appears artificially high. In places where you've got very good testing, you may have a case fatality rate that is more accurate. So you have to be very careful about the measures that are being used, and I think politicians have to be, politicians and leaders have to be very honest about the information they're using. My own opinion at this point is that case fatality rates are verging on meaningless in terms of comparisons across the globe or between regions of the country. I think the most important metric at the moment would be admissions to intensive care units and critical care units. That's where the real pressure points are, and the test of the capacity of a healthcare system to withstand the pressure that it's being put under. So there's that. I think the other thing is, it struck me very much watching leaders like Boris Johnson in the UK and Donald Trump in the United States and elsewhere, whenever they make pronouncements about the pandemic, as is usual whenever they make major pronouncements about anything, they're usually flanked by a set of experts. And what intrigues me about that is the way in which, if we're to believe what experts are asking us to do, or rather, if we're to believe what politicians are asking us to do based on expertise, then it really helps if you don't spend all the rest of the time trashing experts. So how do we trust a government or politicians who, for the past 15, 20 years have been, basically ignoring climate science? Or politicians in Britain, for example, who for the past 4 or 5 years have openly said we don't need experts anymore when we're looking at predictions for what is going to happen under Brexit conditions when Britain leaves the EU. So if you're eroding trust in experts and science in non-pandemic times, when it comes to a situation like this, it becomes much harder to turn around and say, you've got to do what the experts are saying because they're right on this. So that is, it's what happens in non-pandemic times that is actually just as important as what happens in pandemic times.
Someone once told me that trust is gained in drops but lost in buckets.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens post-pandemic with these sorts of debates, because something like a global pandemic such as this also raises questions about the role of climate change, for example. There are big questions about the impact of the pandemic on the economy. And what's going to happen in Britain, I think, is that you're going to get a conflation of the economic impact of this pandemic with Britain's withdrawal from the EU. And it's going to be very difficult to untangle those impacts. But we all need the honest use of data, and that doesn't mean to say we can't argue over how data and predictions and forecasts are created. It doesn't mean to say that science is particularly objective. It doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be debates about what one set of data means. But it does mean that we have to have an honest debate and not just dismissing what experts have to say.
If there was one measure that you'd like to see put in place as a proactive way to prepare for the next pandemic like this one, what would it be?
There seem to be a lot of people saying how we were caught out by this pandemic, and that really isn't the case. In some senses, SARS of 2004 was a dress rehearsal for this. It's a different kind of disease itself, but some countries like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore took very direct lessons from SARS. So I think one of the issues is about pandemic preparedness. But the key to pandemic preparedness actually isn't in the race for a vaccine. It isn't in cities going on lockdown. What it is, and Ebola showed us this. The race for a vaccine, yes, it's important. Lockdown is important. These social distancing measures are important. But what's really the most important thing is that we invest in primary care, is that we invest in healthcare services on the ground that are accessible to a population, that there are no other social costs involved with accessing primary care, because it's primary care that always comes under stress in these situations. But it's also primary care, clinics, immunizations, the availability of those things that actually dictates the capacity of a country or a region or a locality to cope with something like this. So my wish, for one thing, would be that we move away from just thinking about these particular, the stress on intensive care units, on critical care beds as a particular pressure point of this pandemic, and actually thinking about them as something that we need to reassess in non-pandemic periods.
Graham, thanks very much for coming on the show and sharing your insights.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Graham Mooney is an associate professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter, and while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.